Well, that being said, I do I want to get to the kind of like next discussion, and like just on a local level, when um what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and we've had examples of peaceful protests in Alhambra. I went on a spat with I think a former Alhambra local about like different forms of protest, and that's besides the subject. I've said my 2 cents about that. Um, with bad faith arguments about like different forms of protests, and um, in the frame of Alhambra and policing, um, I think my question that I had in mind for this interview, I was wondering in your mind if something as similar to the examples of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and I know Alhambra has its own police department, um, and Ahmaud Arbery, and like all of these cases where um, Black individuals were killed by the police. Is Alhambra ready to have that conversation if something were like that to happen, or are there ways within that city system where something like that shouldn't happen, or like there's policies I'm sorry, policies to make sure stuff like that doesn't happen in that way? And I know you're not like the police chief or anything, but I just wanted to ask, as the mayor, is there anything in a way to address those issues on that police force? And um I don't know if I'm going to get into a discussion about defund the police, but the police budget, as per the state of the city address, is $29 million, right? And then fire is together is $18 million, and like all that together is like that's majority of the city's budget. And we got to look at that majority of that. I look first time I looked at any like city study or like a city pocket finance book. First time I ever saw that. But majority of that is like paying the wages and like doing all of that, all of those things. So it's like it's better than what some other police departments are doing, like buying a tank or something like that. But is the city ready to address if something like that were to happen? I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, so I feel like at this point, my goal is to make sure that something like that never happens,
Right, right.
in Alhambra. And so, I think when I came into this role, well, first of all, there was a lot of kind of politics that were involved. To be very transparent, when I was running, right, my opponent was unfortunately kind of fear mongering folks. I was at the Black Lives Matters march that happened here in Alhambra, and I marched peacefully with our students. I was a part of it was I'm forgetting what the word for it would be, but essentially like there were a group of folks that were protesting in their cars with the NAACP up in Pasadena. I was a part of that, and was a part of peaceful marches that happened, in LA as well. And, unfortunately, my opponent had been kind of spreading these lies that I was going to abolish our police force, that, I was this radical that was just out here, doing these crazy things out in LA. I mean, it was just completely absurd. And so when I came in after I won, I did sit down and I had conversations. I talked with both chiefs, both the previous chief, Chief Vu, the incoming chief, Chief Para, and, I've made really clear to them that for me, one of my priorities is to see us continue to promote de-escalation within the department and to look for new opportunities for us to reduce force as much as possible. And they both understood that. Chief Para really understands that as well. And so there's different things that we're doing, I think, to reach those goals. There's obviously a lot of professional development, an investment that goes into that so that they understand basically how to deal with different situations and not having to use force, using different de-escalation tactics. so that they can, avoid even having to utilize their gun. Another thing that we're doing as well is we have social workers within our police department. And so our social workers go out and they respond to cases of homelessness, they respond to cases of substance abuse issues, of mental health issues. As far as I know, I think we're one of the only cities in the San Gabriel Valley, and possibly one of very few cities in Los Angeles County that has social workers that are responding to these sorts of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they're there to say, hey, do you want help with, with your mental health issue, right? Do you want assistance with your substance abuse issue? If you are seeking out assistance, we can get folks assistance in less than 24 hours. We have a contract with LACADA, where LACADA, and LACADA is the LA County, I'm totally going to mess this up and chop this up, but it's LA County, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting what the acronym is, but essentially they are an organization that provides services to those that are struggling with substance addiction, so that they're able to provide them with counseling, therapy, XYZ, all the things that they need to recover. And so that is, they have 6 beds available for us so that we can call them at any time and say, we have this person that needs help, and they're able to take them in right away. Unfortunately, for other cities, they have to go through an extremely lengthy process to get somebody in. And when you're dealing with somebody that's dealing with a mental health issue or the substance abuse issue, the second they say yes, you want to get them help as fast as possible. You don't want to leave the opportunity for them to change their mind, for them to decide, what, maybe I just shouldn't do this. And so that's one of the ways that we're dealing with that as well. And another thing that I think is kind of helped to ensure that we've had very few cases of use of force in the past is that we have a small police department. And, I don't think a lot of folks realize that, especially for a department like Alhambra PD, we're so small and our city is so small that they're really able to build relationships and get to know residents. And I think it's so important, I've emphasized this to them as well, to be out there in the community so the community knows them, recognizes them, so they recognize residents. And also so they build relationships with residents that are maybe struggling as well. I mean, I think it's really important for our police department to know, folks in our community that, maybe somebody that is homeless, maybe somebody that is struggling with a mental health issue or substance abuse issue, because oftentimes these folks aren't violent. They are simply people that are struggling with something so that's either mental or so deeply personal that they need, outside assistance. Now in California, you can't force somebody, to go into therapy and to get help. And so it has to be on them to make that decision. And that can be a very big decision. But if our department and our social workers are able to create that relationship with somebody, so they're continuing to follow up and say, hey, are you ready? I think you should really take that next step. You can really turn your life around. We're here for you. Whenever you want to make that decision, you just let us know. Then if, something is to happen, if somebody, does randomly call, unfortunately, call the police on one of these folks because, for whatever reason, then when our department goes out there, they're like, hey, we actually know this guy, we recognize him. They already have that built relationship in. And so it doesn't become this immediately kind of like violent, tense situation. And what I've seen, and this is, personally from my perspective, I feel like many of the videos that I've seen occur at some of these very violent videos, you have folks being very reactionary. And so that's problem number one. And then number two, there's no kind of compassion and thoughtfulness in like what's happening and considering the situation of, is this person actually violent? or are they just having a mental health episode?
Right.
But
Right.
if you have a department that actually is connected with the community, then they'll know that. And I think that that's one of the really cool things that we have right now. And I'm really happy that Chief Parr in particular has made even more effort to say, we want to get even more out there. Let's like meet with business owners. Let's meet with residents. Let's talk one-on-one with people. I just think that's so critical. So and you know what? Honestly, I say all of this because I see it working too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a resident, and I won't name him for privacy purposes, but he has been homeless for probably about 20 years, and I've known him since I was a kid. The department knows that I know him, very well, and he's somebody that has been struggling with mental health issues. Had kind of something very tragic happen in his life and his family. And after developing mental health issues, um, unfortunately, turned to drugs, and that worsened his condition. And so he will sometimes, when he's having a mental health episode, do things that are a bit outlandish. I've seen him like try to scare people, jump in front of cars, do things like that. And he is not doing it to be violent. He is doing it because he is, outside of reality in that moment. And so many times I've had to pull over with, myself, my family, and say, hey, and call out to him and kind of connect with him a little bit to get him
Mm-hmm.
back down to earth. And, unfortunately, I think he had fallen into such a deep depression that even though, we tried to convince him to get help and tried to assist him, and our department was, and our social workers were, that he was just being resistant because I think we don't talk about this enough, but for many in the homeless community, or for many that are struggling with mental health issues, they don't feel worthy of receiving help.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very, very kind of deep challenge to deal with and to navigate. And so, we, I remind him of this all the time, and everyone does, but we just continue to try to be as supportive as possible. And just recently, literally a day ago, I had my city manager reach out to me, and she told me that he waved down one of our police officers, and he said, "I'm ready. I want to
Mm-hmm.
get housing." And that was such a cool moment for me, for her to call me and tell me that, because this is someone I've known since I was a kid, and you know, I've wanted him to turn his life around and to be able to receive help, because he's just such a kind human being. And it really breaks my heart when I see people, um, act fearful of him or post photos of him like on social media because they are scared of him. And so I'm just so happy that he's going to be receiving support and services. And, that happens because we've been at it and just been bugging him, for
Mm-hmm.
so many years. And so, and he knows, once I'm ready, I can get help. And so, he's now placed in housing. He's going to be receiving services so he can both recover from addiction and also receive support for his mental health issues. And I'm just so excited and just, really hopeful that this is that moment that we've all been waiting for.
Yeah. It takes a long time to build that relationship, and in the frame of like the question before, yeah, I think it's we as a collective society, like we put a lot on police to deal with, and I think when these the movement to defund the police was just to say, hey, we're paying you to police us in a violent manner. There gotta be a better way to do this. There gotta be, like you said, social workers, mental health professionals, like why can't we pay them a living wage to address the issues that these communities are facing versus having somebody with a badge and gun into those places. And sometimes, tragedies will occur, if you're training police officers to deal with everything as a life and death manner, instead of, telling them, hey, this is another individual in our community. And I imagine, because the police force is quite small, around, you know 40 to 50 officers, and then a lot, like, I was looking through the numbers. It was very fascinating. I know this super dry, and not many people look at like a 400-page study, but I was like, oh, this is the amount of people that actually are on the force. This is the other supports, like in the police department, and all of these things. I was like, oh, this is quite interesting. But the like, you imagine, like, all of them are part of the community. They're small enough that, they can be your neighbors. They can be people that live within the San Gabriel Valley. And I hope that would stay the case, because, you have cases where, if a police officer does wrong, they just move to another county, and then they just continue that cycle of violence. And, that it has to stop somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think Alhambra, to some degree, probably does have that, like, small tight-knit community. In the city I live in, it's like we're at the mercy of, like, the LA County Sheriff's Department. It's like we don't have our own police force. And, like, there are some cases where I'm like, was that really worth it to call the sheriff's department to deal with something like this? Or what could that have been handled in a different manner?
Yeah.
And there are cases, like, yeah, there are things that's going to happen. I think lately, during the pandemic, there's crimes of desperation. There's been a lot of that happening, with good reason. Well, not really good reason, but, like, it comes from somewhere. And I'm trying to remind ourselves, is like, what do you do if you lost your job, or you don't know where your next meal is coming from? It's like, these are individuals that just lost everything.
Yeah.
The same things that happened during the '08 crisis is happening again now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think, we see these ebbs and flows occurring, like throughout how we deal with crime throughout history, right? And I remind folks of this because, we look back to time periods like the 90s, right, which is when we got many of these kinds of really tough on crime, political leaders. But that didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, this was in response to, cases like the Night Stalker, where you had somebody that was, terrorizing, huge amounts of of LA County's community. Right. I mean, this guy was all over. I think he even went like out to the OC. But you had these kinds of high profile killers that were just really touted in media. And it was like, I mean, it was crazy just watching it. I don't know if you've seen the Night Stalker series on Netflix, but I think it's just such a good example of this is kind of what led to this kind of tough on crime mentality that we then had in the 90s. And so, for me as a local leader, what I'm trying to do and be sure of is that I'm being very measured in my approach. And I try to communicate this to my friends that are activists and are part of this criminal justice movement, right? We have to make sure that what we're doing right now, that as we're implementing these things, that they work, and that if they're not working, that we're being very responsive to that and coming up with new solutions, quickly, that we're really monitoring data, and that we're finding out what's effective and what's not, and we're sharing that with one another. Because what I worry about what might happen is if we're not doing that, and then all of a sudden you have progressives that are then implementing these kinds of policies and they don't work immediately, is a kind of backlash that could come out of that. And so, some of the things that I'm really happy that's, happened here in Alhambra is the fact that we are using social workers, and, that program's running very effectively. And, that our PD is utilizing, de-escalation tactics and focusing on this, like, within their training. And what I'm now looking at is, like, how do we scale up the really good work that's happening and take that a step further? And so I've let them know, if you guys need to hire, I think we have 3 social workers right now, 3 or 4 social workers. If we need to hire somebody else, let's do that. let's hire another social worker so we can respond to even, more cases and build out this program. Another thing that I'm looking at is we're looking at a diversion program for folks that essentially get ticketed for riding their bikes on the sidewalks. And one of the things that, I've shared too, because right now the kind of unofficial policy that Alhambra PD has is if somebody is riding their bike on the sidewalk, they don't ticket them. And so, I think that's great. Let's formalize that policy, right? And let's say we're officially not going to be ticketing folks anymore. And instead, if you are riding your bike on the sidewalk, we're going to send you to a biking safety program that's done in multiple languages. It'll be with active SGV, and we'll do that. And so it's like taking little things that are working right and scaling them up. I think that that's kind of been my approach, especially given like that we have a very small, kind of city and a very small department. But I'm really happy because I feel like these things are working right. And this is how we take these kinds of progressive policies and how do we, how does our response to these issues become something beyond policing, right? And so rather than ticketing somebody, for riding their bike on the sidewalk, instead of doing that, we're providing them with education. And so I'm continuing to kind of like look for new opportunities like that. So I think this is a really important time period. I feel like everything for me as a progressive, especially as a progressive elected, I feel like everything that I do in this time period in regards to public safety is so important because I feel like we're in a really important defining moment. And so we really have to deliver.